The world of the early 18th century was a place ruled by rhythm, natural rhythm. Days unfolded according to sunlight, seasons guided farming, and human labor defined the speed of production. Most people lived in rural villages, tending land their families had worked for generations. Life was predictable, slow, and often harsh. Poverty was widespread, disease was common, and the majority of people rarely traveled far from where they were born. But beneath this quiet, agricultural surface, pressure was building. Europe's population was rising, cities were growing, and demand for food, clothing, and goods was increasing at a pace traditional methods could no longer satisfy. Farmers could not harvest enough grain to feed expanding towns. Artisans could not weave enough cloth for the growing market. Trade routes stretched wider, empires expanded, and global connections tightened. The world was ready for transformation, even if no one recognized it yet. The Industrial Revolution did not begin with a dramatic explosion or a world-shaking invention. Instead, it started quietly, in workshops, in coal mines and riverside mills, in the minds of men who saw possibility where others saw only limitations. It was a movement born from curiosity, necessity, and ambition. A revolution powered not by weapons, but by ideas. In the early 1700s, Britain offered the perfect conditions for something extraordinary to happen. The island possessed abundant coal deposits, a rising merchant class, a strong banking system, and a growing appetite for innovation. Colonies around the world provided raw materials, while British ports connected the country to global trade. At the same time, political stability, rare in that era, created an environment where new ideas could flourish. The first major change came not from factories, but from fields. The agricultural revolution introduced new farming techniques, crop rotation, selective breeding, and innovative tools that increased harvest yields. Fewer workers were needed to produce food, and as a result, thousands of people moved from countryside villages to cities in search of work. This migration created a new workforce, young, desperate, and willing to take any job to survive. At the heart of this emerging industrial world was energy. For centuries, humans had relied on muscle power, human and animal, and the limited force of wind and water. But coal, long ignored, held the potential to fuel a new age. Coal mines expanded rapidly, and miners extracted the black rock that would become the foundation of industrial progress. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen created a steam engine designed to pump water out of flooded coal mines. It was slow and inefficient, but revolutionary. Suddenly, humans possessed a machine capable of mechanical labor, a machine that never grew tired, never needed rest, and could operate endlessly. Although crude, Newcomen's engine lit the first spark of mechanized power. But it was James Watt, a Scottish instrument maker, who took that spark and transformed it into a fire. In the 1760s, Watt redesigned the steam engine, making it dramatically more efficient. His engine became the heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution. It powered factories, pushed locomotives, and fueled ships. It unlocked a world where production no longer depended on location or weather. Power could now be generated anywhere, and on a scale humanity had never seen. With steam power rising, industries across Britain began to evolve. Nowhere was the transformation more visible than in textiles. For centuries, weaving cloth had been a slow, labor-intensive process. But the inventions came quickly: the spinning jenny, the water frame, the mule spinner, and the power loom. Each machine multiplied productivity, making cloth cheaper, faster, and more abundant than ever before. Factories emerged, first in England and then across Europe and America. Massive buildings filled with rows of machines, all humming, clattering, and turning raw cotton into finished fabric. Workers, many of them women and children, labored long hours, often in dangerous conditions for low pay. Smoke filled the air, dust coated their lungs, and the relentless pace of machines defined the rhythm of their daily lives. Cities expanded rapidly, with industrial centers like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool transforming almost overnight. Brick buildings rose where fields had once stretched, streets filled with workers, merchants, factory owners, and carts carrying coal and cotton. The old rural world was fading, replaced by a new urban landscape, crowded, chaotic, but bursting with energy. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how people worked, it changed how they lived. For the first time in history, large numbers of people depended on wages. Time became a measurable resource, divided by the factory bell, which dictated when workers arrived, took breaks, and left for home. The relationship between humans and labor shifted. Work was no longer a family craft passed down through generations. It was an economic necessity driven by the needs of industrial capitalism. But with hardship came opportunity. Some people found new wealth in industry, inventors gained recognition, business owners built fortunes, engineers solved problems that had once seemed impossible. Railways expanded across the countryside, making travel faster and cheaper. Steamships connected continents. Goods that had once been luxuries became accessible to ordinary families. Slowly, the world began to feel different. People were no longer confined by geography or tradition. Machines amplified human capability, enabling production and innovation at unprecedented scale. Urban life introduced new ideas, new ambitions, and new forms of communication. The Industrial Revolution was not simply a technological shift, it was a psychological one. People started to believe in progress, in the idea that the future could be better than the past, that human beings could shape the world around them rather than be shaped by it. By the end of the 18th century, the changes were undeniable. Britain stood at the forefront of global transformation. Industry, powered by steam and driven by ambition, reshaped society from the ground up. But the revolution was far from over. The next chapter would bring expansion, conflict, innovation, and upheaval on a scale the world had never witnessed. The machines were only beginning to roar, the cities were only starting to rise, and soon, this industrial wave would cross oceans, reshape continents, and redefine what it meant to be human in the modern age. This was the beginning, the spark that would change the world forever. The Industrial Revolution was not simply a technological event. It was a human earthquake, an upheaval that reshaped livelihoods, identities, emotions, and the rhythm of everyday life. By the early 1800s, the world stood on the edge of a transformation so profound that even those living through it barely understood the scale of what was coming. For centuries, human productivity had depended on muscle, whether human, animal, or the brute force of nature. Work moved to the slow rhythm of the seasons. Life was local, predictable, and confined to the limits of what hands could build and what simple tools could shape. But with the introduction of steam power, mechanized factories, and new manufacturing systems, the very definition of work changed forever. The first factories, powered by giant water wheels and steam engines, rose like metal giants in the heart of once quiet landscapes. Their tall chimneys pierced the sky, exhaling black smoke that signaled a new era. Inside these structures, machines driven by pistons, belts, and gears hummed with relentless precision, machines that could spin cotton thread faster than hundreds of skilled workers combined, machines that could weave fabric, forge metal, and push production forward at a pace the world had never seen. For factory owners, this was nothing short of revolution. Production costs fell, output soared, profits expanded. A new industrial elite emerged, entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in every new invention, ready to build empires on steel, steam, and ambition. Wealth, once tied to land and nobility, now flowed toward people willing to innovate, invest, and risk everything. But for workers, the story was far more complex. The rise of factories meant leaving behind the open fields and village workshops for dark, crowded industrial towns. Families migrated en masse from rural areas to growing cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool. This mass migration became the fuel that powered the new industrial age. Inside the factories, the work was different. Instead of skilled craftsmanship, workers now operated machines. Instead of flexible hours, they followed the unyielding timetable of factory bells. 12-hour days were normal. 14 wasn't uncommon. Breaks were few. The machinery was loud, dangerous, and unforgiving. Accidents were frequent. Wages were low. Yet people came, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Industrialization had not only created new opportunities, it had disrupted old ones. Traditional artisans, handloom weavers, blacksmiths, spinners, found themselves competing with machines that could do their work faster and cheaper. Many faced ruin. The factory was their only option. For women and children, the industrial age brought unique challenges. In many factories, children made up nearly half the workforce. Their small hands and quick movements were considered ideal for operating or repairing machinery. They earned a fraction of what adults earned, often working the same long hours. Women, too, found work in textile mills and industrial workshops, juggling factory shifts with responsibilities at home. Life outside the factory walls was equally harsh. Industrial cities grew too fast for proper planning. Streets were narrow, housing was cramped, entire families lived in single rooms, sanitation was poor, disease rampant, rivers became polluted, air thickened with soot. For much of the working class, industrialization felt like a trade-off. New opportunities, but new hardships. But change, once set in motion, moved quickly. Steam power brought an unprecedented shift. Trains began rolling across Britain, pulling freight and passengers faster than anyone had imagined possible. Goods once confined to local markets could now be shipped to distant cities within hours. The world felt smaller. Economies became linked. Ideas spread faster. The train became the great equalizer of mobility, a symbol of progress, freedom, and the unstoppable march of innovation. For the first time, ordinary people could travel great distances, connecting communities like never before. Coal mining, too, expanded rapidly. Coal became the beating heart of industrial energy, providing the fuel for steam engines and the heat needed for metal production. Thousands descended into dangerous underground mines, chipping away at the black rock that powered nations. The work was perilous. Explosions were common. Many died young. But coal was essential. It kept factories running, trains moving, and furnaces burning. Meanwhile, iron and steel production advanced through powerful new techniques. The creation of molten metal in industrial furnaces led to the birth of stronger, more durable materials. From these advancements came tools, engines, bridges, and eventually skyscrapers, structures that reflected a world rising from the strength of its own technological ambition. With industrialization came new social questions. Who held power? What rights did workers deserve? What responsibilities did employers have? What was the balance between profit and human dignity? Over time, public pressure grew. Reformers spoke out about child labor, safety, and living conditions. Writers and thinkers documented the struggles of the working class. Slowly, painfully, laws began to change. Child labor was restricted. Work hours were reduced. Safety standards improved. Education spread. Industrialization was reshaping minds as much as markets. It pushed societies to rethink justice, equality, and the value of human life. It challenged old hierarchies, disrupted long-standing traditions, and created new social classes. The rise of the urban working class, the proletariat, would eventually give birth to labor unions, socialist movements, and new political ideologies. Cities became centers of debate, activism, and reform. But even as these social battles unfolded, technology continued advancing. New inventions emerged at a breathtaking pace. Telegraphs, photography, the sewing machine, mechanical looms, improved steam engines. Each innovation altered life in ways both subtle and profound. Families began purchasing factory-made goods. Clothing became cheaper. Tools became accessible. Consumer culture began to form. The world was shifting from survival to production, from production to consumption. The Industrial Revolution was no longer just a British phenomenon. It was spreading. France, Germany, Belgium, and the United States began building their own industrial networks. Factories multiplied, railroads expanded, global trade intensified. Nations that embraced industrialization grew wealthy. Those that did not fell behind. By the mid-1800s, the world was entering a new phase of human experience. Population soared, life expectancy improved, scientific discoveries accelerated, urban centers became vibrant hubs of innovation, creativity, and commerce. The modern world, the world of mass production, urban living, fast travel, instant communication, was taking shape. But industrialization also revealed deep contradictions. The wealth it created was unevenly distributed. Economic inequality widened. Some became extraordinarily rich, others remained locked in cycles of poverty. Nations competed fiercely for resources and markets, leading to political tensions and global rivalries. Industrialization, with all its triumphs and tragedies, had set humanity on an irreversible path. It had changed how people lived, how they worked, how they traveled, how they socialized, and how they imagined their futures. It had created the foundations of the modern economic system, capitalism, while also igniting the philosophical battles that would challenge it for centuries. It was a revolution not just of industry, but of identity, and the world was only at the beginning. As the 19th century advanced, the Industrial Revolution was no longer a British phenomenon. It had become a global force, radiating outward with unstoppable momentum. Factories, machines, and mechanized production spread across Europe, North America, and eventually deep into Asia. The world entered an era where old traditions collided with new technologies, where the familiar rhythms of rural life were replaced by the relentless pulse of industrial cities. The transformation was sweeping, intimate, and irreversible. Industrialization changed where people lived, how they worked, how they traveled, what they consumed, and even how they understood time itself. For millions, it brought new opportunities, new wages, and new freedoms. For others, it brought exploitation, instability, and hardship. And in every corner of the world touched by industry, societies had to confront the question, what does progress cost? And who pays for it? Urban explosion, the birth of the modern city. In the early 1800s, Europe's landscapes began to change at a speed no previous generation had witnessed. Small towns ballooned into sprawling industrial centers. Rural families packed their belongings and boarded trains, wagons, and boats to chase the promise of factory wages. London, Manchester, Liverpool, New York, Boston, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, every major city of the era became a living engine of industry. By mid-century, cities had become symbols of opportunity and suffering at the same time. For many newcomers, city life meant higher wages than rural farming, access to goods and services never seen before, schools, hospitals, and new public institutions. A sense of possibility, a future shaped by human ambition. Yet, the booming populations created intense pressure. Streets overflowed with people, buildings rose in dense clusters. In working-class districts, multiple families often shared one room. Water sources became contaminated. Disease spread rapidly. Cholera, tuberculosis, influenza. Urbanization brought innovation, but it also exposed the cracks in modern society. Writers like Charles Dickens captured this duality, the promise of progress standing side by side with grinding poverty. His works, though fictional, were grounded in the very real experiences of children working in factories, families trapped in slums, and cities struggling to keep pace with their own growth. Still, cities continued to expand because they represented something new, a hub where technology, labor, and opportunity converged, and every factory built became a magnet pulling the world toward an industrial future. New social classes, the world. Reshaped by work for centuries, society was divided into landowners, clergy, and peasants. But industry introduced a new social order, one defined not by land, but by labor and capital. A powerful industrial middle class emerged: merchants, factory owners, investors, engineers, railway magnates. They represented ambition, innovation, and economic influence. Their decisions shaped cities, built railroads, financed ships, and expanded banks. Opposite them stood the working class, millions of factory laborers who powered the machines that powered the world. In cotton mills, coal mines, steel foundries, and assembly shops, workers endured 12 to 16-hour shifts, low wages, dangerous conditions, little job security, almost no legal protection. Children were especially vulnerable. Small hands and bodies made them useful in mines and mills. They crawled into tight spaces, cleaned gears, or hauled coal, tasks that often ended in injury or death. Parents didn't want to send their children to factories, but economic survival often forced their hand. As the exploitation grew, so did a sense of injustice. Workers began organizing into labor unions, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. Strikes erupted across Britain, the United States, and Europe. The industrial age had created extraordinary wealth, but it also created extraordinary inequality, and people were no longer willing to accept their suffering in silence. These movements laid the foundation for modern labor rights: the 8-hour workday, minimum wages, safety laws, and the end of child labor. Every benefit workers enjoy today is rooted in the struggles of this era: industrial empires, wealth, power, and global reach. Industrialization gave nations enormous economic and military power. As factories multiplied, so did governments' ambition. Many European powers realized that to fuel their industries, they needed vast amounts of raw materials: cotton, coal, rubber, oil, copper, palm oil, and food for their growing cities. This need for resources sparked the expansion of industrial empires. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and later, the United States and Japan expanded aggressively into Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Steamships and railways made long-distance travel and control possible. Telegraph lines allowed armies and governors to communicate instantly across continents. To the industrial powers, this was globalization, an interconnected world of trade, commerce, and economic expansion. But for many regions that were colonized, it meant loss of sovereignty, exploitation of labor and land, political domination, cultural suppression. Rubber extracted from Congo, cotton grown in India, copper mined in Africa, and oil drilled in the Middle East. These resources fueled the factories of industrial nations and built their wealth. Industrialization was not just a technological shift. It was a reorganization of global power. The world's balance tilted dramatically toward nations that mastered machines, factories, and modern industry. Revolution in transportation, railways, steamships, and the shrinking world. Perhaps the most dramatic impact of the Industrial Revolution was on movement of people, goods, and ideas. For thousands of years, long-distance travel was slow, dangerous, and accessible to only the richest travelers. But by the mid-19th century, everything changed. Railways. The railway became the symbol of modernity, with steam locomotives roaring across landscapes. Distances that once took days on horseback could now be covered in hours. Railroads connected factories to ports, moved coal, iron, and finished goods with unprecedented speed, encouraged migration, and new towns unified nations by connecting remote regions. In the United States, the Transcontinental Railroad linked the east and west coasts, transforming the nation into a continental power. In India, British-built railways restructured the economy, society, and administration of the entire subcontinent. Steamships, steam-powered ships replaced wind-dependent sailing vessels. Travel across the Atlantic or Indian Ocean became predictable and fast. Steamships transformed international trade, immigration, warfare, diplomacy, cultural exchange. Millions of Europeans migrated to the Americas in search of new lives, an enormous demographic transformation made possible only by industrial transportation. The world had become smaller, faster, more connected, and far more dependent on industrial technology. Communication revolution, telegraphs, and the industrial mind. If the railway brought people closer physically, the telegraph brought people closer intellectually. For the first time in history, information could travel faster than a horse, a ship, or a person. Messages that once took weeks could reach another continent in minutes. Telegraph cables stretched across nations, and by 1866, the first successful transatlantic cable connected Europe and North America. Business leaders negotiated deals instantly. Governments communicated military orders across oceans. News traveled at lightning speed. Stock markets in London and New York became synchronized. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change machines, it changed the human relationship with time. The world became impatient, fast-paced, hungry for instant results. This shift in mindset still shapes our behaviors today. Industrial age. Consumer culture, the rise of everyday convenience. With factories producing goods in massive quantities, prices fell, and ordinary people gained access to items once considered luxuries. The Industrial Revolution introduced affordable clothing, mass-produced furniture, newspapers, watches, bicycles, canned food, sewing machines, household tools, and equipment department stores emerged, turning shopping into a new cultural experience. Advertising expanded, appealing to dreams, identity, and aspirations. Consumers became essential to the economy, and the economy became essential to identity. For the first time, the average person had options, choices in clothing, goods, food, and household products. A new lifestyle was emerging, one built around comfort, convenience, and consumption. The human cost, pollution, exhaustion, and social disruption. While industrialization created prosperity, it also produced a darker legacy. Pollution filled the air and water. Factories burned coal day and night, covering cities in soot. Rivers turned black with chemical waste. People living in industrial districts breathed smoke that damaged lungs, shortened lifespans, and spread illness. Working conditions were brutal. Machines amputated limbs. Mines collapsed. Dust and fibers caused chronic diseases. Many workers died young. Industrial capitalism prioritized output and profit, often at the expense of human well-being. Traditional communities broke apart. Rural life, once centered around family and community, dissolved as millions moved to cities. New social problems emerged: loneliness, crime, alcoholism, domestic conflict. Industrialization was powerful, but it was not gentle. Progress came with a human price, and societies struggled to find balance. The intellectual awakening, new ideas for a new era. The Industrial Revolution wasn't only about factories, it transformed how people thought. Philosophers, economists, and activists began questioning the new industrial world. Karl Marx analyzed the exploitation of workers and predicted class conflict. Adam Smith's ideas of free markets influenced industrial capitalism. John Stuart Mill advocated for individual rights and social reforms. Charles Darwin introduced evolutionary thinking, changing science forever. Social reformers fought for labor rights, women's rights, public health, and education. Industrialization triggered an intellectual revolution that reshaped modern politics, economics, and society. A world forever changed. By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed nearly every aspect of human civilization. It had reshaped societies, families, labor, transportation, communication, global power, human expectations. The world was no longer agricultural. It was mechanized, urban, and interconnected. The journey was far from over. A new century was approaching, a century of electricity, automobiles, airplanes, telephones, skyscrapers, and global warfare. But none of it would have been possible without the Industrial Revolution's massive wave of transformation. Part 3 closes as the world stands on the edge of a new era, one powered not just by steam and steel, but by human ambition and the unstoppable momentum of innovation. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Industrial Revolution had already altered Europe and North America. But its influence was not destined to remain within those borders. Like a stone dropped into a vast, still lake, the ripples of industry expanded outward, touching empires, colonies, cities, and remote communities that had no factories of their own. What began as a series of technological innovations in Britain was now shaping the political borders, economic systems, cultural patterns, and human relationships across the planet. The world was entering an era of global industrial civilization, an age defined by machines, markets, migration, and unprecedented change. The age of empires fueled by industry. Industrialization created two powerful needs for industrial nations. 1, raw materials. 2, new markets. Factories needed cotton, coal, copper, iron, rubber, wheat, and timber. Populations pouring into cities needed food, clothing, and cheap manufactured goods. The solution for European empires became clear: expand, control, extract. In the late 1800s, industrial powers raced across Africa and Asia, carving borders with little regard for the people already living there. The British Empire stretched from Canada to India to Australia. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany seized vast territories, fueled not only by the hunger for resources, but by the competition of industrial nations desperate to maintain economic dominance. Steamships, railways, telegraphs, and rifles, products of the Industrial Revolution, became the tools of empire. Nations that had industrialized early gained overwhelming military and logistical advantages. A single ironclad ship or a regiment armed with breech-loading rifles could overpower entire regions whose warfare had not transformed. This gave rise to a new global hierarchy: industrial nations and non-industrial nations, a division that shaped the geopolitics of the next 150 years. The rise of global trade networks. As steamships crossed oceans with predictable schedules, global trade transformed from an unpredictable gamble into a structured, efficient system. Goods no longer had to wait months for favorable winds. Coal-fired ships could cut across seas with mechanical certainty. Telegraph cables laid across the Atlantic Ocean allowed businesses in London to communicate instantly with markets in New York or Bombay. Prices of cotton, grain, copper, and textiles could be monitored in real time. The world, for the first time, became economically interconnected. A farmer in the American Midwest grew wheat that fed workers in Manchester. A miner in the Congo extracted rubber that fueled factories in Belgium. Tea grown in India was consumed by families in English towns. The industrial world created a new kind of dependency, one that bound continents together through production and consumption. This modern era of globalization was not balanced or equal. It often benefited industrial nations far more than the regions supplying their raw materials. But it marked the beginning of a world economy, a vast, interlinked system that every person today participates in, often without realizing it. The birth of modern cities. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how people worked, it changed where they lived. Cities that had once grown slowly began expanding at breathtaking speed. Populations that had remained stable for centuries suddenly doubled and tripled within decades. London, which had around 1 million people in 1800, surged past 6 million by the early 20th century. New York, Chicago, Berlin, and Tokyo underwent similar explosions. Skyscrapers became symbols of progress. The modern city skyline, vertical, crowded, illuminated with electric lights, was a direct product of industry. Inside these cities, life was loud, chaotic, and restless. Electric streetcars replaced horse-drawn vehicles. Indoor plumbing transformed sanitation. Sewage networks reduced disease. Gas lights and then electric lights extended the day, allowing shops and factories to operate into the night. Urban living became a laboratory of modern behavior: anonymity, mobility, diversity, opportunity, inequality. Cities promised prosperity, yet often delivered hardship. Families lived in tenements stacked like brick beehives. Streets smelled of coal smoke, horse manure, and open drains. But despite these hardships, millions of people, immigrants, farmers' children, rural laborers, flooded into cities with the hope of a better life. That hope became the fuel of modern civilization. New social classes, new social challenges. Industry reorganized societies into new hierarchies. No longer were people simply peasants, artisans, or nobles. A new structure emerged: the industrial elite, factory owners, financiers, railroad magnates, banking families like the Rothschilds and Morgans; the middle class, engineers, accountants, teachers, clerks, managers, professionals; the working class, millions laboring in factories, mines, and mills. Industrial workers became the backbone of national economies, yet their political voices were limited, their wages low, and their conditions harsh. This imbalance led to new movements: labor unions, socialist parties, and populist protests demanding fair wages, safer workplaces, and shorter hours. By the late 19th century, strikes shook cities across Europe and America. Workers organized, marched, and sometimes clashed violently with police. Governments struggled between suppressing unrest and reforming laws. This tension birthed the modern labor rights we take for granted today: the 8-hour workday, child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, the right to unionize. These protections were not gifts, they were won through decades of struggle. The industrialization of war. Perhaps the most striking and most tragic consequence of the Industrial Revolution was the transformation of warfare. Before industry, wars were fought with muskets, swords, horses. After industry, war became mechanized, efficient, and devastating. Mass-produced rifles replaced handcrafted ones. Railroads transported troops and supplies at unprecedented speed. Factories created artillery, machine guns, armored vehicles. Telegraph lines allowed commanders to coordinate in real time. And in 1914, these forces collided in a conflict the world had never imagined possible: World War I. Trenches, tanks, submarines, chemical weapons. This was industrial warfare in its darkest form. The same machines that powered factories also powered destruction. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity new tools, but it had not yet taught humanity how to use them without catastrophic consequences. The Second Industrial Revolution: electricity, steel, and the age of invention. The late 19th century brought a second wave of industrial transformation. Electricity, steel, petroleum chemicals, mass production. Inventors like Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and Henry Ford reshaped everyday life. Electricity illuminated homes and streets. Telephones collapsed distances. Steel allowed bridges and skyscrapers to defy gravity. Automobiles replaced carriages. Assembly lines made goods affordable for millions. Industry was no longer limited to Britain. It was sweeping through Germany, the United States, Japan, and beyond. The transformation of everyday life. The Industrial Revolution did not simply transform nations. It transformed the rhythms of ordinary life. Before industry, people lived according to the sun, the seasons, and the pace of nature. After industry, life was governed by the factory clock, the train schedule, the electrical grid, the market price. Food came from factories, not farms. Clothes were machine-made, not hand-stitched. Cities became the centers of culture, politics, and opportunity. Mass-produced books, newspapers, and radios spread ideas across continents. People began to see themselves not just as villagers or townspeople, but as citizens of a nation, and later participants in a global world. Why the Industrial Revolution still shapes us today. Every part of modern life, transportation, medicine, communication, education, entertainment, work, is built upon foundations laid by the Industrial Revolution. And when you switch on a light, you experience its legacy. When you ride a bus, train, or car, you participate in its evolution. When you browse the internet, you continue the technological journey it began. We live in the world the Industrial Revolution created, a world of innovation and inequality, of progress and pollution, of interconnected economies and fragile systems, a world filled with unimaginable opportunities and unprecedented risks. It is a world shaped by machines but guided by human choices. And with every new advancement, from artificial intelligence to renewable energy, we continue writing the next chapter in the story of industrial civilization.